Welcome back, scholars. So, you have completed your vocabulary and the planning section of today's lesson. We are now going to dive into the lesson and our independent practice. So, scholars, you should have on the side of you or in front of you your T chart labeled Cleopatra's situation. You have two boxes. Each box should have Cleopatra equals. Again, as we go through today's lesson, our focus is to explain Cleopatra's current situation. So we are diving on into our lesson. We are going to be reading from page 42. I am going to read aloud. As I read aloud, I want you to consider the following. What was happening in Egypt while Cleopatra was in Rome? And how did this affect her return? Also consider, what did Cleopatra do to her brother and why? Again, we are reading starting at the top of page 42. Upon returning to Egypt, Cleopatra found herself and her son in a vulnerable position. By then, Ptolemy XIV would have been about 15, old enough to demand equal power and old enough to become a rival. Meanwhile, her sister Arsinoe was up to her usual tricks, working behind the scenes to sow dissent and confusion. In Cleopatra's absence, Arsinoe had tried to pass off as an impostor of Ptolemy XIII. Alive and well, was claiming his place on the throne. Their plan failed, but it would not be surprising for Arsinoe to convince Ptolemy XIV to conspire with her against their sister. Cleopatra needed to get rid of the young king. We're going to pause. Let's find evidence to explain what was happening in Egypt while Cleopatra was in Rome. How did it affect her return? And what did Cleopatra do to her brother and why? Going to give us 1 minute to find that piece of evidence. A minute to start. You are writing your evidence on your tracker. All right, go ahead and finish up your notes. All right, so scholars, in my evidence, I paraphrased all of it. I wrote that Cleopatra was vulnerable when returning. Arsinoe and Ptolemy XIV was kind of causing some issues for her. And I wrote that she needed to get rid of her brother, and that brother being Ptolemy XIV. So, scholars, now that we have our piece of evidence, let's go back to see our focus question. Today, we're looking for Cleopatra's current situation. Based on the evidence, what do we now know about Cleopatra's situation? I'm going to give you 1 minute. You're going to make your claim based off the evidence of Cleopatra's current situation. And we're writing. 35 seconds. Right, scholars? So I wrote that Cleopatra is vulnerable. Vulnerable being one of our vocabulary terms, but Cleopatra is vulnerable because her siblings, which means her brother and sisters, are trying to take and steal her authority and power in Egypt. So far, we realize that upon her return, Cleopatra finds herself vulnerable. She does realize that her sister and brothers are a problem. She will need to get rid of her brother, and I wrote that she is vulnerable because they're trying to take over her power and her authority in Egypt. We're moving. So, our next question is: how was Egypt affected by the political unrest in Rome? What evidence supports our answer? Scholars, we are going to read, and remember, you are welcome to go back and read both pages. We are going in and just chunking this information so that we're able to complete our T-chart. So, scholars, before we begin to read at the top of page 43, I want to give you a brief context. Ptolemy the 14th is now dead. People are beginning to speculate and think that Cleopatra either killed him herself or she had a servant to do it. Now, remember, as we're reading, we are trying to see what was the political unrest in Egypt. And we're reading. Without Caesar's support, however, Cleopatra faced growing uncertainty. The struggle for power in Rome left Egypt's future hanging in the balance. Would the new leadership change its policy toward Egypt? Could Cleopatra still depend on Rome's aid and protection to help her maintain her own power and authority? Cleopatra had to wait and see. So now that we have that, let's go in, find our evidence. You're going to write your evidence. We're answering the question: how was Egypt affected by the political unrest? And we're writing that response in this box. You have 1 minute. Let's go. If you finish, go ahead and start thinking about your claim. You can go ahead and start writing your claim as reader. Five seconds. All right, scholars. So, for my best piece of evidence, I simply wrote that Egypt's future was hanging in the balance. So, again, you can go back, you can reread that paragraph, but we now need to make a claim. How was Cleopatra's situation based on the evidence that we have now? Let's write our claim. You have 1 minute. 30 seconds. Ten seconds. All right, and that is time. So, scholars, I am going to share with you my notes. Again, for my evidence, I did put that Egypt's future is hanging in the balance. And then for my Cleopatra equals, I still wrote that vulnerable because I want to make sure that when I am responding in my independent practice and my ACE paragraph, I am using vocabulary terms. So I did write that Cleopatra is vulnerable because the unrest made Egypt's future uncertain. Cleopatra did not know what would happen to her country. Going to give you a few seconds. You can look at my notes on the screen. If you'd like to revise, you can revise your notes at this time. All right, we're moving. So, scholars, on our notes today, we have the answers to the following question. What is Cleopatra's current situation? Now, we know that Cleopatra's current situation is, yes, she's vulnerable. We know that she is vulnerable because we see that her siblings, they're trying to take her authority away from Egypt. We also know that Cleopatra feels that her brother she needs to get rid of him. We later see in the text that Ptolemy dies and that people are speculating that Cleopatra killed Ptolemy or that she had a servant to kill Ptolemy. As we continue to read, we realize that Egypt's future is uncertain and Cleopatra is very uncertain about Egypt's future. She's not sure if she will have the protection of Rome. And at the end, we realize that Cleopatra does not know what will happen to her country. That is a recap of today's lesson. Now, scholars, let's remember big picture. We had to answer the question, why is it so important to Cleopatra to conquer Mark Antony? On yesterday, we learned who Mark Antony was, and today we learned about Cleopatra's current situation. Let's look at this, break this question down so that we are successful in answering our exit ticket. First, let's talk about the word conquer. Conquer is a verb, and it means to overcome or take control of a place or people by the use of military force. So when you look at our prompt, we're actually answering the question, why is it important to Cleopatra to control or take over Mark Antony? We responded by saying, it was very important to Cleopatra to conquer Mark Antony and control their interactions because she needed his might and power to help secure her rule over Egypt. When Cleopatra returned to Egypt after Caesar died, she found her sister conspiring against her and quickly had to kill her brother to ensure her authority. She was unsure of Egypt's position because of the unrest in Rome. Mark Antony, who had ruled over part of Rome and looked forward to future conquests, could offer Cleopatra the protection and security she needed. Therefore, she felt it was important to get Mark Antony on her side. So, scholars, it is now time for your independent practice and your exit ticket. Remember to use your notes from today and yesterday's notes to help you answer the question, why was it important for Cleopatra to conquer Mark Antony? Scholars, be sure to respond using an ACE paragraph in today's exit ticket. Your paragraph must include an argument, context, two pieces of evidence, and an analysis. When you're writing your independent response, be sure that you offer a claim with an inference or a claim with a because statement. It's been a pleasure teaching you guys, and I will see you on tomorrow.